for inviting me. And if you want to move down, you can. I don't know what the acoustics here are because I don't have a mic, lapel mic. So if you want to be a little closer, feel free just to move down. Let me expand just a bit on who I am so you'll know why I'm talking about what I'm talking about. First of all, there is one handout there from a little recent piece I wrote that is in the New Boston Post, where I've been posting because it's a blog site. I've been posting a number of little op-eds that I've been writing for several years. And Matt McDonald, who is the editor, seems to be very happy with publishing them with very minor changes made to them. I used to work until 2003 in the Massachusetts Department of Education. I was an associate commissioner under David Driscoll, who was the commissioner. And if you've been around in the schools for a long time, you might remember David or remember who he was. The names change so often that people do forget. But David was commissioner for quite a while, and I reported to him, and I was the person in charge of revising all of the state standards and licensure tests and teacher licensing regulations and a few other things. Doing all of those standards, I acquired a national reputation because Massachusetts had what were considered the best sets of standards across all subjects in math and science, as well as English and history, and in several other areas, better than any other state as a full set of standards. California also did well, but its students didn't have the chance to have the same benefits of those standards as Massachusetts kids did. And if you had children in the schools before 2010, which is when the State Board of Ed adopted Common Core, your children would have been benefiting from, or grandchildren would have been benefiting from, the standards that the department, when I was there, had helped to produce, and they would have been taking MCAS tests that were based on those standards. The original MCAS tests were first class, they were very good, and the kind of tests that kids are getting now, based upon the Common Core standards that were adopted by the Board of Education in 2010, don't even come close. But that's a whole different and very sad story. I was also on the State Board of Education after I retired from the Department of Education, and had a first-hand chance to see what was happening from a state board perspective with the adoption of Common Core's standards. What is Common Core? It was, for those of you who still may not be sure, it's a set of what are now probably national standards that have been paid for by the Gates Foundation. This is well known. I'm not saying anything scurrilous or out of the ordinary. The Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation gave money to a couple of organizations in Washington, D.C. in 2008 and 2009 to develop what they wanted to see as national standards to serve as the basis for national tests, and PARCC is one of those national tests that was developed by people who used to be here in Massachusetts at the department. So I know some of the people who actually were behind the development of the PARCC test, and then there were another test that was centered in California. But whatever tests are used are national to the extent that they use some of the same test items, and then some wizard behind a green curtain at the Department of Education sets a cut score after the results are synthesized. It's a very mysterious process, and nobody knows who has vetted these tests and who exactly has set the cut score. So all of you people who have friends or grandchildren or relatives in the schools are taking tests that nobody knows anything about, unlike the old MCAS tests, which were state tests. They were developed here in the state, and teachers, English teachers, now I'll speak more specifically of the English language arts because my area is reading and English language arts. English teachers and reading teachers vetted the test items that were then used for MCAS tests. And then when MCAS tests were first given, there were cut score setting committees. These are committees that decide who shall pass and who shall fail. Where is that line going to be? And some teachers were on those committees too. Every year they would vet and review the test items. Here in Massachusetts we had some good writing open response questions, and our own state teachers in English would correct those writing open response test items so that they had a chance to understand what kind of writing our kids were doing, and whatever kinds of scores kids got back, it was from teachers in the state who had corrected their writing. Multiple choice can be done by a machine anywhere, but it was the writing that was important. And I don't know what is happening today with the writing that takes place, because it's very difficult to get information. Rhode Island, if you know anybody there, has just decided to use the same tests that Massachusetts produces that are called MCAS, only they'll call them Rhode Island's tests. And we don't know whether they'll have writing test items, who will correct them, and I don't know that Rhode Island parents are in any position to get any information there either. But when I was in the department and we had our own state tests vetted by our own teachers and the writing corrected by our own teachers, we had very good tests and very good standards that were in the classroom, in teacher training programs, and even in professional development criteria for teachers in our schools, so that we ended up with a very strong system, which was later called the Massachusetts Education Miracle, because our kids went to the top in Massachusetts on all of the NAEP, National Assessment and Educational Progress tests, given in grade 4, grade 8, and grade 12. And Massachusetts kids hit the top from 2005 on, 5 consecutive testing years. They're still among the top, but the points are beginning to decline as Common Core makes its impact on whatever teachers do in classrooms, and they have to follow what administrators and others elsewhere tell them they have to do. So you now have a system of education in your schools that's controlled from the outside. It's not controlled, as we all have had towns and cities with their own programs, their own curriculum, but then when we had state standards, they were guided by the state standards. Now we have national standards, and the goal of the state plan that is now in, and I hate to throw out these acronyms at you, ESSA, E-S-S-A, or the ESEA, which is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, going back to Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. But the kind of plan we now have in this state demands that we, quotes, close gaps. How many have heard of that expression that we're trying to close gaps, or it's gap closing? Well, you have to ask yourself, what does it mean to close gaps? Because the law itself, and I have looked at the act many times, doesn't even identify who the gaps are between, because it can't. Who's it going to say the gaps are between in a law? Real problem there. But to say that you have to use standards that help you to close gaps raises the question, how do you close an achievement gap? what happens when you close an achievement gap? No one knows how to close the gap, which is why the gap hasn't closed. We've had the gap for maybe hundreds of years. We've had kids at the bottom, kids at the top, low achievers, high achievers, and now the gaps are to be closed for the different groups of kids that can be identified in different ways, racially, ethnically, disabilities, language, native language. There are new groups that come up almost every couple of years who are considered low achievers and are part of the gap. And what do you do to close a gap? Do you lower the ceiling? What does that mean? How do you close a gap? We didn't close gaps with our standards. The legislature in '93, that's the Massachusetts Ed Reform Act, was very clear. Everybody was to do better. So when you get everybody doing better, you're not closing gaps, which is a different direction. And philosophically, that's where I was. We were creating standards that would raise everybody. But if you're raising everybody, you're not closing gaps. You close gaps only if you do something to some groups, either lowering them or raising the others faster than the other groups are accelerating. So you have a problem when you have standards that are designed to close gaps when nobody anywhere in the world knows how to close gaps. If you look internationally, no one has an educational system that closes gaps because no one knows how to close gaps. They basically are, and I've only decided recently that we have to start calling them for what they are. They're racist standards. They assume that the children that you're trying to close the gaps for can't learn what other children can do. So all you can do is figure out how to close the gaps, because we've tried everything under the sun for 50 years, since Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, 1965, and nothing has worked. And when we look at the latest NAEP scores, which come out every other year from the testing agency in DC, they will give you national scores, grade 4, grade 8, high school level, based on samples. And it turns out that as of 2015 and 16, the scores either are plateauing, they're declining, but the gaps are growing. They're not getting together. They're actually, in some cases, getting wider. But is anyone saying maybe we've got the wrong standards? No, because that would be like admitting that you guessed wrong. So we have some other issues involved in even trying to change Common Core standards. There are different groups, and someone was showing me a letter today. There are still national campaigns trying to get rid of Common Core standards. We try to do it here in Massachusetts, and Justice Botsford, Margot Botsford, tossed out the ballot question that had over 100,000 signatures of parents mainly on it, and said that, and this was her peculiar reasoning, legal reasoning, given to her by Foley Hogue, a very expensive law firm in Boston, who developed the lawsuit to get rid of this ballot question, which would have been on the November ballot last year. But she said that if you have, as a part of your ballot question, an attempt to disclose the test items, the transparency is not related to the test. And you ask any teacher and they will tell you, well, how else are you going to know what's on a test if you don't see what the test items are? And yet she reasoned that it wasn't coherent as a ballot question because the transparency of the test was affected by disclosing the test items. there's nothing you can do with a Superior Court justice who thinks like that. I discovered that if the legal reasoning is off, I don't know if any of you are lawyers, but there isn't much you can do once a justice who's in charge of it decides that this is how to look at the issue. In any event, this is what is now in a state plan. You have to close gaps, and it doesn't seem to matter that the gaps are not closing, and they may even be widening. Students are doing worse as a whole, so the gaps are widening, but we're not having the higher performers get higher. They're just a little lower than they were. They're just, the gap between them and the bottom is getting wider. Things are all going in the wrong direction. That's what's now happening. And that's partly what I was trying to talk about here. But it goes way, way back, about 100 years, because we've had declining reading standards, and that's where I come in with my professional training, because I was trained to look at reading research and reading tests and anything to do with reading when I studied under Jean Chall, a noted reading researcher at Harvard. Some of you may or may not be familiar with her work because she did most of the spade work in understanding reading research and how to look at reading levels of textbooks, to any kind of text, literary or non-literary. But it goes way back to the beginning of the actually 20th century, as we have had lower and lower levels, just very gradual over the course of a century, so that if any of you, when you were very young and could speak to a grandparent who remembered, and if they graduated from an 8th grade grammar school years ago, because that's what they were called, grammar schools were K-8, and that's what most people went to and graduated from. They didn't even go to high school years ago. What they read in grade 8 was like what kids read in college today. It was mature works. Why? Because that was as far as they went, but they had to be able to go to town meeting, read the warrant, and read any other adult material that was available. So grade 8, which was the end for large numbers of kids years ago, meant that you had really become a mature reader. And that began to slip to the point where after World War II, which is still way past most of you, as far as way back in ancient history, if you can find people who went to high school after World War II, only the college-going group of kids actually read adult materials. What the others read, we're not sure, because things began to decline. Yet more and more kids were going to college, which is part of the puzzle of how you explain how more kids could go to college with lower reading abilities. What was going on in the colleges? Well, we know that there was more and more remedial reading, and there's also a question of what standards a college has. The development of community colleges made a big difference as opposed to the small liberal arts colleges, which had a different mission. That's a very different topic, but it's all part of this picture today of how do we cope with declining populations of readers. Today, according to the reading level of the books that Renaissance Learning, a company that produces what are called accelerated readers. I don't know if any of you are familiar with, these are curriculum libraries in schools, and they're in many, many low-income high schools. But the average reading level of the average American high school graduate is at the 6th grade. How does a country survive? How do you have town meeting? How do you have people reading a warrant? You can't survive if the average population level of reading is about at the 6th grade level. And it's been going steadily downhill since the beginning of the 20th century. Common Core, instead of pushing things a little bit in the other direction, has kept the trend going a little bit down and has widened, as I say, the gap between those at the very bottom and where the average is. So that maybe some people are tearing their hair out, but I don't know what administrators in schools do today to get kids. There are a lot of other influences on kids, we know that. Whole wide range of influences on their reading. We know kids don't do as much reading as they used to. The problem is that there's no substitute for reading. There is no silver bullet, and you can't develop a reading vocabulary unless you do a lot of reading. So if there's no substitute for reading and kids read less and less, what do our schools do? We don't know what's going to happen. We haven't reached the bottom of the road yet. The bottom of the barrel, whatever the metaphor might be these days. But we have ways to go. We may get kids through the elementary school, but who knows what they're going to be able to read by the time they get to high school. I don't know if any of you ever think about a work which is very popular and is a very good novel, To Kill a Mockingbird, which is at about the 6th grade level. It was written from the perspective of a 7-year-old child. So it has a minimal vocabulary. It's got adult subject matter, which is why it's used in high school. It's a wonderful novel. I'm not knocking it at all. But if that is all, that kind of reading that kids do in grades 11 and 12, they're being deprived of the challenge of reading tougher material, which you need. How do you go to read the war in the town meeting from reading a chapter in To Kill a Mockingbird? You just look at the words and the length of these monosyllabic words. It was written from a literary point of view of a child writing story, recollection of what happened. Now, I promised that I would, not yet, but stop at about, I guess, little after 8:30 or so that you can ask questions. But I want to focus a little bit more on how the damage is being done, which I would like to stress, through Common Core's standards. You might want to know, why did people, boards of education, business leaders, USED, lots of people everywhere, governors, why did they go for a set of dumbed down English language arts standards? There's no content in them. I've been the foremost critic. Why? Because, as Elaine mentioned, I was on the Common Core Validation Committee in 2010. I got there because Mitchell Chester, who just passed away and was the Commissioner of Education in Massachusetts, put me on that validation committee. I was the only English standards expert on the committee. There was one mathematician on the committee. You have to understand Common Core is a set of English standards and a set of math standards. I was the English language standards expert. Jim Milgram from Stanford was the mathematician who was the math expert on the standards. We both were among a handful of people who would not sign off after a year on these Common Core standards. We were all asked, there were about 30 of us on the committee, and we were asked to sign off affirming that the standards were research-based, internationally comparable to the best that was out there, and rigorous. Now, this is a word that's been used over and over again, and nobody knows what it means anymore because it's used all the time. Jim and I independently said we couldn't possibly sign off on standards that in his area of math were, as far as he was concerned, dumbed down. And I won't say too much about high school math because that is basically a mystery to me, and I take his word for it, that if you know enough math, there are ways to get to calculus, but if they're missing in Common Core, you're not expected to get to calculus from Common Core's math. And he could speak to the mathematicians and the other people who were helping to write the standards, because he obviously, as a professor of mathematics at Stanford, understands what's in his own discipline. And I could look at what's in the English language arts standards and say, if you have no content requirement at all, how will you ever get kids to read high school level material in high school? That's the goal. You want kids to read high school level material in high school. If you are still teaching them how to read 6th, 7th, and 8th grade material by the time they're in 11th and 12th grade, how are they going to read their college textbooks? How are they going to read anything to do with informed citizenship? So what was going on with what they were trying to do? Again, this is a reflection of gap closing. But what was the focus in these standards? They had the same number of standards for reading literature as standards for reading non-literary works. This is one of the big things that you will hear a lot of teachers complain about, although they won't do it publicly if they value their jobs. And I have learned that, and I've spoken all across the country. And I can just tell you one little incident in Morton, Illinois, where a meeting was set up for me to talk to the English teachers at the local high school. Not one showed up, but the union rep showed up. And he said, I want you to know that any teacher who showed up tonight would have the word insubordination put in their personnel folder. So that's why no one showed up. But he could show up because he was the union rep for the building, and his job was secure. So he was willing to come and tell us. Now, I never checked it out. I'm not going to go call up a superintendent and ask, did you really tell teachers X, Y, and Z? But it's very rare to get any teacher. I just testified recently in New Hampshire about a month and a half ago. And the people who testify are teachers and administrators who will say, oh, the standards are wonderful. We've never had such great standards in our life, but not one critical note at all. And you realize that they're earning brownie points doing it. I don't blame them in one sense, because they want to keep their jobs and they may be advancing in some way in their buildings, but you're not going in public to hear criticism by current teachers. The only places, and I've testified all over the country in about 30, 35 legislatures, the only time you will get a teacher or an administrator to say something negative is if they have just retired. Then you're free. You can go, you can say whatever you want if you're retired. And that was what they said. They were now retired and they could speak. If you look at the Common Core standards, you see not only this division between reading literature and reading non-literature, which makes no sense because that's not how English teachers were ever trained. What were English teachers trained? Why did they become English teachers? They liked reading literature. And what did they teach in high school? I had to think back. I grew up in Bridgewater. I had to think back, what did my small town high school English teacher do? We read a Shakespeare play every year, but there were other things that we read that was part of the, quotes, traditional curriculum. She had us learn how to read between the lines. We talked together about what we didn't understand, and I didn't understand a lot because Shakespeare was not the language of my home, so I didn't know how to easily understand Macbeth or Hamlet or whatever else we were reading. Even Dickens, which was very long, he has a huge vocabulary. So I didn't get any help at home, and I needed class discussion. But if you have standards divided half and half, which takes away the time of reading between the lines, because when you're reading informational stuff in an English class, you're reading stuff that's supposed to be clear, that shouldn't have to be read between the lines. You don't read between the lines of a medical prescription. It's what the prescription says that you want to understand, not what's between the lines of it. Whereas a poem, you've got to read between the lines of everything in a poem in order to understand it well. And you have to figure out where things give hints about the meaning of other things. But you also have not only a reduction in the kind of reading, but a kind of literary reading that requires thinking about what's behind what an author is saying. You also have an unusual focus on doing a lot of writing. Now, that is at first to a lot of people puzzling, because they think, well, what's wrong with a set of standards that asks kids to do a lot of writing? Kids need to learn how to write, and they don't write very well. Should half the time in class be spent teaching writing? And as someone who has done writing lessons in class and observed a lot of classes, I will say that where is the major influence coming from on how you write? It comes from what you read. Most teachers know that, which is why it's like 2/3 reading and maybe 1/3 writing. It's not that they're ignoring writing or trying to skimp on the teaching of writing. It's just that if kids don't see what a good English sentence looks like, it's hard to write one. Particularly for ESL kids, the more they see the written language, the better it is for them. As writers, we absorb and learn how to by doing a lot of reading. But if you're spending a lot of time, and I used to read the stuff, setting up in the elementary school the author's chair, where kids would be asked to talk about some experience they have written about, and the other kids would ask questions, and then they'd spend time revising. All of this is a useful process, but it's taking up an enormous amount of instructional time, and no one added to the length of the school day. It's still the same. It's still about 25 hours a week. So what was taken away? What was reduced? We don't know, because researchers never looked at it. I would keep asking, you can't spend more time doing X unless you've taken something away from Y. What was Y? Was it handwriting? Was it spelling? I mean, who knows? We don't know if no one's going to bother to actually look or ask teachers, because the day wasn't lengthened. I taught elementary school many decades ago in the town of Easton, and I remembered how arithmetic was the first hour, and I was told when they're fresh and they can do arithmetic, you hit them from 9 to 10. And that was it. 9 to 10 was arithmetic. That was an hour every day, 5 hours a week. And if they didn't get it, then you could do extra work later on, seat work that you could give them to do. But you had to have a certain amount of instructional time, and then you would have the reading block, and that was the whole morning. Everything else was in the afternoon. I looked at how time was structured, but the critical things were arithmetic and then reading, and whatever else you did, you fit in if you could. But you had to spend time hearing kids read, and if you had a class of 40, you had to figure out how to do it. This was beginning of the end of the baby boom days, when you had very big classes and they got smaller as towns were able to hire more teachers and build more elementary schools. I watched this whole development here from scratch because I was a part of it. But if you spend a lot of time teaching writing in class, why? Because you can't expect kids to do it at home? That was part of the assumption. If you couldn't expect kids to write at home or read at home, then you made time in school. And so that was when you had to take time away from something else. In my hometown, where I've lived for many years, Brookline, I was on the library board for 14 years. When we were renovating the library, we decided because I and others kept urging, we need to have a lot of carols in the public library. I don't know what your library's like here, but the idea is provide places for kids after school to come and work in peace and quiet, because many kids can't do it at home, we know that. And librarians don't want parents leaving little kids in the library and having them serve as babysitters, which we heard from our reference librarians in Brookline. They knew all the tricks that parents were playing, but the carols were there for kids who were from, say, 10 or 11 on up. And that was where we could coordinate and structure a little more time. But school was over when it was over, when the janitor closed the door or said, you've got to get out now. I mean, things at some point have to end in school. Lived through those very rigid hours. And we learned that you had to find other options for kids. But if you decide there are no other options and it all has to be done during those 25 hours in school, there's going to be a lot that isn't learned. And today we're facing kids who aren't reading much because they're not going to do it outside of school. And even if they do it in school, how much time can they spend reading or writing? So everything becomes in school except for those students who are able to do it outside of school in addition, or their parents send them to schools where they are given the time outside of school that's supervised in some way. So you end up with a set of standards that have ramifications. That was one of the words you used. You asked me to talk about it. You end up with a set of standards in your classes that have ramifications that extend to the entire curriculum. Kids can't spend as much time on history, geography, science, or anything else because too much time is being spent on things that they're not doing at home, which in an older time they were expected, some of them, to do some of it at home. It can't all be done in 25 hours during the week. Kids have to get up, they have to have recess, they've got to move around. I mean, there's a humane treatment of kids as a part of this, and there is now a website that has been developed about child abuse in the classroom where they've canceled recess because they were looking for more time for the reading, testing, teaching to the test kind of stuff. And so you get rid of recess and you've got particularly little boys who can't sit still for very long and are very eager and can't pay attention to what's going on because they want to get up. And good teachers, I remember seeing them in Arkansas, every few hours they'd say, okay, stand up and we do exercises or something, because these kids have to move. So you have a problem in managing lots of little children where you are focused by your standards and the teachers may be held accountable for them. This is one of the battles going on right now. So I can't tell you what the final result is because it's a battle all across the country, whether teachers should be held accountable in some way and for what percentage of kids' scores on these state tests. I don't think the situation here in Massachusetts is as bad as it is in some other states where by law 50% of a teacher's evaluation is going to come from the kids' scores. But how does that make a teacher feel? What does that make a teacher do? Quit. Well, yes, quitting is a different, that's a serious problem. We have loads of retirements and teachers deciding not to come back to teach. And who's going into teaching? That's a lower number according to some of the recent figures. And there are threats about crises, teacher shortages, but it's hard to know exactly what's going on because it depends on who's spinning the numbers so that you have a good idea of what the agenda might be. We've known for years that we can't get math and science high school teachers, but that's not because of Common Core. It's for other reasons, and this has been going on for years. It goes back 15, 20 years when I was in the department, where we had special programs to try to encourage very able graduates of our liberal arts colleges who knew math and science, or military who had completed their, whatever it was, 15, 20 years in the military, who would then get these scholarships and a very brief training period, who would then be able to be hired legally by high schools for the math and science. I went to a high school where we didn't have one full-time math teacher at the time, because that was what it was like years ago in many small-town high schools. That wasn't a teacher shortage. That was simply, there was no reason for someone who has been a math or science major to go teach in a high school when they could get a much better paying job elsewhere. Now, they can easily get much better paying jobs elsewhere, and then they look at the kind of paperwork they have to do. Why would they want to teach at a high school? If you have a good math or science teacher in your high school, they're gems, and you do whatever you can to keep them. This is like going from small town high schools, which became regional. I don't know what Wayland still has its own high school, but, and Bridgewater combined with Rainham. I mean, I know there were a lot of regional high schools in the area. After World War II, there was a lot of coordination because they were trying to figure out how to enable small town high schools with small high school graduation numbers to get together so they could hire full-time math and science teachers. Now that they can, the teachers aren't there for other reasons. So I am going to stop now and let you ask some questions, and then if you want some suggestions as well on what people can do in their own communities. You all come from different towns, many of you have town meetings, but please feel free to ask whatever you think I can handle on relationship to standards and testing, whatever is here in Massachusetts. And remember that our video photographer is not going to identify you or the words you say, only whatever I answer. So please feel free to raise your hand.
Can you tell us what these Common Core standards are doing?
Can you just speak louder, please?
Can you tell us what these Common Core standards are doing to the college entrance SATs?
To the SATs? That is a complex topic, mainly because the SATs have been changed in the last few years. They've been aligned down to the level of the Common Core deliberately by the person who was then put in as president of the College Board, David Coleman, who had helped to write the Common Core standards to begin with. But a lot of money, Gates gave a lot of money to the College Board. He became the president about 5 years ago after he finished writing ELA standards, and apparently none of this is documented. This is part of the, I mean, none of this could be documented. This is part of the problem. His first task was to change the SATs. So SATs have been dumbed down. ACTs have a set of tests that have been dumbed down. They equivocate. If you call up, and I have a friend who has called them up to try to find out, did they align to Common Core, or didn't they align to Common Core? And one day they have, and the next day they haven't. So they may have a test on the shelf in the back room that if the school system asks for it, they might get it. But if it's going to be part of a Common Core national testing, then they will take out the other test. So and all of the norm-based reference tests like the ITBS, Iowa, Metropolitan, some of these may be familiar names to you, all of them, I've been told, have been aligned down. And right now there's an attempt being made to change even the NAEP grade 4 tests, so in math, so that it reflects Common Core math. Now, what happens, what does that mean technically? If a test is testing exactly what the teacher is teaching, kids' scores may rise, but it doesn't mean that they know more math or better math. They have been prepped by the very tests which are not supposed to be standards-based NAEP tests. So SAT and the AP tests have been changed so far. That's still an ongoing process. Some of them have run into trouble as far as the content too. The AP US history, that's another whole disaster story in itself for people who are looking for the real content to US history. But when you have all the tests being changed or aligned down to a lower level, then you can't trust your tests. You don't have an independent, what you're trying to find, or what parents and others need, is an independent source of information on how well your kids are doing. I've been writing about this in little bits and pieces, because what you want as a parent, or as an educator, as a teacher, what does a score of, say, 73 mean on a math test if you're told this is where this child is? What does it mean? You don't know. I mean, you have no idea. Where is the anchor that tells you what it means? Now, there is another international test that Massachusetts used several times. It's called TIMSS, Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study. There are only 2 international tests, but this one has its own governing board. Nobody can monkey with it. And Massachusetts entered as a country in 11 and in, 07 and 11, and our kids in math, this is sort of like getting independent information on our math and science standards and whatever teachers were doing in the classroom. Our kids were in the top 6 countries in the world in math, and tied in grade 8 science in first place with Singapore. We were all thrilled. I mean, this meant that we had good standards and teachers were teaching to them, because what else could a tie in first place in grade 8 science mean with a country like Singapore, where you have got Chinese educators who are making sure their kids are studying day and night, and then they come to this country, study at universities, and go back. Jim Milgram meets them because he's at Stanford and he knows all the Pacific Rim universities. So we had a way of getting independent information. Then there is the other test, which the Department of Education has been pushing, called PISA, PISA. Programs in International Student Assessment. Sorry about all these acronyms. If you're into testing, you learn about them. PISA is focused on skills, and it only gives one test for 15-year-olds. This past year, Massachusetts just did PISA. It didn't do TIMS, even though we had 2 other years that we had done TIMS. So we could have done TIMS and then found out whether our kids were doing the same or had declined. That would have been the only way we could find out. And they knew it, so we didn't do it. The powers that be in the education, and this would include from the governor's office down, because Secretary of Ed, they all have to know what they're doing if they decide they're not going to participate in a test because it costs money, and somebody's got to budget the money. So we have this PISA test that is based on skills. This is the test that little Finland rose to fame and glory about 10 years on. And the Finnish mathematicians were suspicious. I'll go into that story slightly, because at least we know what they did, because it's a small country. And they came out first place, and everyone was raving about little Finland. They had reformed, and their kids were doing so well. And the Finnish mathematicians at their university said, they're not doing so great at the university level or at the high school. They're not learning the math they should know. let's take a look at the level of the math on the test items that are on PISA. And they did, and they said, so far as we can tell, the math is at the 5th or 6th grade level. You're getting skills tested that you can say represent high school, but the math people want the content there. The skills will come with the content, but you've got to have the content there. So they said, go for TIMSS. Let's Finland go for TIMSS and not do PISA again. And lo and behold, what happened was that Finland, under pressure from its own mathematicians, you have to read what's available in English because who can read Finnish, but they did go and get kids, they enrolled in the next round of TIMSS and did worse. So it was very clear that PISA was overestimating how good they were because it was testing skills, and the content for the skill in math, which is what they were looking for, was low. Now, reading skills is like another whole area. I won't go into those details, but the point is that you've just got these two international tests, and the real basic question that you're raising is, how do we know how our kids are doing? What does a grade mean? What does a score on a test mean if you don't have some anchor somewhere? And that was what TIMSS provided, because it had a group of educators from like 25 to 30 countries who all said, here is what should be in the grade 5 math curriculum or the grade 5 science curriculum. Here's what should be studied in a grade 6. Wasn't everything, but this would be a core of what we would think as you go up the grades. So you'd say, okay, here is the best judgment. It can't be research because you've got to get professional judgment on what should 6th graders anywhere in the world be studying in a first-rate school system. That's the question you're asking. And it's not easy to get a good answer unless you can get a group of educators from a number of countries who will agree about what are the topics that could be studied. And Singapore was doing a terrific job with its kids because they produced the material. That's a very long answer to your question, but it's a very important question, and we can't do much with it. Anything else or any follow-up?
How difficult does this make this for people who are trying to do college admissions?
All right, say the last part again.
How difficult is it for people who are doing college admissions, looking at only scores in kids'
I don't know how they work today. I can't, it's like an unknown area to me because everything is changing all the time. I mean, they get grade 11 tests from that are supposedly college and career readiness tests, but who knows what the scores mean? No one even knows who's putting the percentages down. You know, how many shall pass, how many shall fail, how many are doing advanced work, performance level, whatever. No one, you know, it's like a crapshoot. No one really knows what these things mean. So I don't know how college admission folks are doing. The SATs used to serve a good predictive purposes, you know, that they could tell you who's going to stay in college based on whatever numbers or something, some cutoff score for the SAC, the verbal and math SATs, not the content SATs. And now the predictive part of it has been damaged by being aligned down because it takes, as a test assessment person I know has told me, it takes years to build up the information because you have to look at what happens to kids who go to college. Look at what scores they got in high school, and then take a look at what they did in college. So it may take another 5 or 6 years to accumulate the information. We don't know. Nobody knows. They will tell you they know. I mean, people will just say things today off the top of their head, but we have no idea.